Okay, let's talk about how you can save some money sewing. It is a brand new year, which means people are taking up new hobbies, setting goals, making resolutions, but this also means a lot of people are spending a lot of money on these new things. So if sewing was one of the new hobbies that you've decided to take up, or maybe you got a sewing machine over the holidays, or maybe you've just been sewing for years and spending way too much money on it, this video is for you. I'm going to talk about some of my absolute favorite ways that I save money when I'm sewing, so let's get started with tip number 1. So the first thing that I want to talk about that is probably the biggest expense when it comes to sewing is your machine. Now, the thought of going out and spending hundreds of dollars on a sewing machine, especially if you're not quite sure if this is even something that you want to be committed to, can be pretty intimidating. So let me walk you through how you can save some money. The first thing I would recommend to you is check out if you have any libraries or like art centers, community centers in your area that have sewing machines. In my area, I know there's a few digital libraries that have sewing machines, so as long as you have a library card, you can go and sew for however long you want. I think this is a great way to kind of test out if this is something that you want to invest more time and money into. The next thing that I would recommend is checking out thrift stores. I think that a lot of times sewing machines at thrift stores get completely walked past because most of the time they're in their cases. So this is what my sewing machine case looks like. So I can see how if you're not familiar with sewing machine names, you could easily just gloss over this at a thrift store. But keep your eye open for things that look like this, because under that case might be a beautiful sewing machine that might just need a little bit of oil and a nice cleaning. You might need to get it serviced, but that's not really a big deal. So keep your eye out for that. Most sewing machines that I see at thrift stores go for between like $20 and $40, so it's not a bad price range. The next place that I would recommend looking if you're not having luck at thrift stores would be Facebook Marketplace or any sort of online selling platform like that. What I will say about this though is I think they do go up a little bit in price on these websites, at least in my area I've noticed that. So you might be looking more like $50 to $200 for a machine. But the nice thing about that is you might be able to have a guarantee from the seller that it's been serviced recently or that it's, you know, running the way that it should be. The next thing that I would recommend, this is how I got started out with my first sewing machine, is to just ask around and see if anybody you know has one and they don't use it anymore. I think that sewing machines are something that a lot of people have just sitting in their closets or basements or attics that haven't been touched in years, so they just need a little bit of love. Just clean them out, give them some oil, and they should be good to go. The sewing machine that I learned on was a Singer from the 60s that was a hand-me-down from family friends, and it worked perfectly for just about everything I needed it for years and years. So just ask around. See what happens. So the next thing to think about once you have your sewing machine solidified is, of course, fabric. I think anybody who sews, especially if you've been sewing for years, you know how easy it is to just build up a huge stash of fabric and not quite know what to do with all of it. In my experience, other people who sew are always so enthusiastic to meet somebody else who has the same interests as them, and chances are if they have an overflowing fabric stash, they'll be more than happy to help you out with some fabric, especially if you're just getting started. I know I'm always so excited when I hear other people want to learn how to sew, and I also always have way too much fabric, so it's a win-win for both of you, honestly. The next thing I would recommend, of course, is checking out thrift stores. I think if you go in with an open mind, anything made of material in there can be reused. So I like to use clothing items, tablecloths, curtains, draperies, whatever it might be. But a lot of thrift stores also do just have a material section, so always keep your eyes peeled for any sort of interesting fabric. Thrift stores are where I get most of my fabric, and I've been able to find some really beautiful pieces. I will talk about fabric stores briefly as well. I do shop at fabric stores, but personally I just think it's more fun to look for fabric at thrift stores. There's more of a hunt involved. I would say get to know the fabric stores in your area and which ones have good clearance prices and good clearance selections. And also keep your eye out for when you're shopping for fabric. I think most fabric stores do this where they'll give you a discount if you finish the bolt. So that's a little trick. Keep that in mind if you find a fabric you really love and it's near the end of the bolt. When you go to get it cut, just ask how much there is on there. Obviously, you don't want to buy too much fabric and waste it, but if there happens to be the right amount and you finish the bolt, usually you'll get like 10 to 20% off. Okay, so you have your machine, you have your fabric, now we need to make something. So let's talk about patterns. Patterns can get pretty pricey, especially if you're making a lot of different garments. I think that it is justified in the price because pattern drafting is such an amazing skill, but for a lot of people, it's just not feasible. So again, check thrift stores for patterns. I always find amazing patterns for $1 or $2, and a lot of times you can also find really fun vintage patterns. The one thing that can be tricky about buying patterns at thrift stores is finding the right size for you. However, if you do find a pattern you love and it happens to be in your size, chances are it's not going to be cut apart yet. So as long as you fall into the size range that is on the pattern, in my experience, most of the patterns I see at thrift stores have never been cut into, so you can make it perfectly to your size. Another method I use for acquiring patterns is to just use my own clothes and either try to clone them without cutting into them. So that kind of depends on what the garment is and if it can easily be laid flat and traced. Or if I'm getting rid of something, if it's stained or has holes or it's just not my style anymore, but maybe the fit was really amazing and I'm willing to sacrifice it and cut into it, I'll just put it in my closet in my studio and pull it out when I need a new pattern, cut it apart and transfer it onto pattern paper, or I might just leave the pieces as they are. This is a really fun way to sort of just get creative and almost work backwards, taking a garment apart and seeing how it was made. I think this can be really helpful sometimes when you're starting out looking at patterns. It can be really confusing looking at pieces of paper and trying to imagine how that will translate into a garment. So starting with a garment and working backwards can sometimes be helpful. It's also so fun just to take something really, really basic and see how many different ways you can elevate it. Take a t-shirt, for example. You can make hundreds of different designs just by cutting apart a t-shirt and using that as a pattern. So things don't have to be so linear, you know. Start looking around your wardrobe or at patterns that you might already have and think about how you can alter them. It's really not as hard as it seems. The last thing that I want to touch on in this video is thread. So what I like to do to save a little bit of money is when I go shopping for thread, I will buy a few spools of white thread and a few spools of black thread. And I find this basically matches most projects. I got a few TikTok comments about this when I made a video about thread matching, and a lot of people said that they use gray thread. So they said a sort of middle of the road 50% gray matches almost everything. I definitely need to try this out because I don't think I've ever worked with gray thread, but it definitely sounds like a great idea. So of course, when you have a very distinct color and you want to do a top stitching detail, buy matching thread. But I would say buy the smallest spool possible so that you're not left over with too much of that distinct color and have nowhere to use it after. But when you are left over with these very distinct colors, use them on the inside of your projects where they won't be seen. That way you can use up all the thread, and if they're just clothes that you're making for yourself, it doesn't matter what they look like on the inside, unless it's gonna show through. If you're working with like a chiffon or something, if you might see the inside thread, it really doesn't matter. It's just you who's gonna see it. So use the thread up so that you're not dealing with all these spools of thread that you won't use. Another TikTok comment I got that was super smart as well is to use these colors that don't match anything for basting. So basically, if you are sewing anything by hand to just kind of hold it in place and then remove that thread later, it's really helpful if you use a contrasting color so that you can easily spot that thread, as opposed to the thread that's in your machine that you're actually sewing the project together with. And lastly, if you're working on a project and you want to do a top stitching detail and you don't have the matching thread color, if you want to save a bit of money, or you just don't want to go to the fabric store, that's me all the time, just take a contrasting thread color and use that as your detail. I think this can be a really amazing detail, and it can honestly make your projects look a lot more elevated if you choose the right color. Okay, those are all my money saving ideas for sewing. I'm sure there are a million more ways you can save money out there, but hopefully this just gave you a bit of a jump off point, especially if you're just starting out. Hopefully this kind of minimized your intimidation looking at the cost of sewing, because it really doesn't have to be that expensive.